Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Documenting Compliance with HUD's Noise Standard and Noise Control and Abatement Standard. My name is Catherine Au from ICF. I'm joined today by my colleague Rob Green from ICF, Danielle Shoup at HUD's Office of Native American Programs, and Chantel McKenzie at HUD's Office of Environment and Energy. This is a continuation of a webinar series sponsored by ONAP on environmental reviews. Last year we did 4 webinars and they are all online on the HUD Code Talk website under resources. This is the second webinar of this series this year. Last month we had a webinar on tiered environmental reviews. That one should be posted online in another month or so, a month or two. And today's webinar is being recorded and will also be available online on the HUD Exchange and HUD Kotalk websites in about 2 to 3 months. And then in 3 weeks, we have another webinar on navigating compliance with the Endangered Species Act for HUD-assisted projects in Alaska. And so that is specifically for folks who are in Alaska on using programmatic agreements and guidances to determine compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And then next year we have a couple of more webinars to come, so stay tuned. Today's objectives are to outline HUD's noise control and abatement standards, discuss how it applies to tribal projects, identify sources of data for different noise generators, and present HUD tools on calculating mitigation requirements, as well as walk through sample analysis for common situations that you might see in your own communities. Okay, so the reason we're concerned with noise is that it is a health hazard and nuisance. Studies show that chronic exposure to high noise levels can really affect health outcomes for residents. So high noise levels are undesirable for HUD projects that are noise sensitive uses. HUD discourages projects that involve noise sensitive uses in areas with unacceptable noise exposure. And then common noise generators are going to be your transportation sources such as airports, roads, and trains. First, to get you oriented, the HUD regulations are at 24 CFR Part 51 Subpart B, and that's going to be the noise standard. HUD's general policy is to provide minimum national standards to protect citizens against excessive noises in their communities and places of residence for HUD programs. Further along in the regulations, talks about the environmental review. Responsible entities must consider the noise criteria and standards in the environmental review and consider ameliorative action, so that's going to be mitigation, when noise-sensitive land development is proposed in noise-exposed areas. And then the next section of those regulations talk about how it applies to different HUD activities. So HUD support for new construction is prohibited for projects with unacceptable noise exposures. Unacceptable is going to be greater than 75 decibels. And HUD assistance is discouraged for projects with normally unacceptable noise exposure, which is going to be above 65 decibels. And this applies to all HUD programs that assist housing, manufactured home parks, nursing homes, and hospitals. And then for modernization and rehab, first, modernization. In any noise-exposed areas, HUD shall encourage noise attenuation features in your alterations. If you're doing major or substantial rehab projects in the normally unacceptable and acceptable noise zones, then HUD shall actively seek to have project sponsors incorporate noise attenuation features. And here, the difference between modernization and substantial rehab is going to be substantial rehab is when environmental assessment is required. And then in the unacceptable noise zone, HUD strongly encourages conversion of noise-exposed sites to land uses compatible with high noise levels. And as a reminder, EA versus CEST or CADEX subject to 58.5, the rehab that qualifies as CEST is listed under 5835A and 5830 A1 and A3. Here are the different categories of noise levels that HUD considers. If you're 65 decibels and under, that is acceptable. If you're between 65 and 75 decibels, that's normally unacceptable, and 75 plus is going to be unacceptable. And we'll return to this again later. How do we apply this to tribal projects? The first question you want to ask in your environmental review when you're considering noise is your project a noise-sensitive use? A noise-sensitive use is going to be places where people sleep, including residential properties, hospitals, and nursing homes. That comes straight from the regulations, as well as areas within a housing development where loud noise could be a safety concern. If you have a housing development that has a playground within the development, or balconies, decks, things like that, those could also be a noise-sensitive use. If you have a standalone playground, then these regulations actually don't apply. And then there are also many projects that you might be undertaking that don't qualify as noise-sensitive uses, such as an office building or warehouse or maintenance building where it really doesn't matter how loud the surroundings are, people aren't spending too much time there. Then no further compliance with the noise standard is necessary. Your project type is not a noise-sensitive use. For gray areas, the tribe, as the responsible entity, can always choose to consider a project a noise-sensitive use if they want to. For example, your senior centers, day clinics, and cultural centers, there's no HUD requirement for you to consider it as a noise-sensitive use, but if you think that it is something where you do want to make sure you're protecting the occupants from high noise levels, then by all means go ahead and do this analysis. And then for rehab programs, you want to ask this question. Do you have standardized noise attenuation measures that apply to all of your modernization and minor rehab projects, such as use of double glazed windows or extra insulation? So these are measures that improve the building envelope components or redesign the building envelope to make it more insulated. And that's not just from noise, it also helps with weatherization, and that can really lower your energy bill. Basically, any of those insulation measures that do lower your energy bill will also lower your noise. And here we have a single paned window, and then in that unit, they rehab that and change that into double paned windows. So you can see an example there. And so if you do have standardized noise attenuation measures that you apply to all your projects, no matter if they're in a loud area or not, then your project is in compliance. You just document your policy, your standards for this type of rehab. And then in the environmental review, in the 58.5 checklist under noise abatement and control, you say no mitigation measures required, and then you list out what your standard noise attenuation measures include. And so a recap of what we just went over before we go to the next section. First, you ask, is your project a noise-sensitive use? If it isn't, then the noise standards do not apply to your project. You just document that your project is not a noise-sensitive use and you're in compliance. If you are a noise-sensitive use, such as housing or a place where people sleep, then we ask another question. Is your project modernization or modern rehab? If your project is substantial rehab or new construction, then you will have to screen for noise generators near your project. If your project is modernization or minor rehab, then we ask another question, which is, does your program include standard noise attenuation measures for all units? If not, then you just go ahead and screen for noise generators. But if so, then you document it and you're in compliance, and we showed that in the previous slide. And so next we go on to the actual noise analysis where you screen for noise generators near your project. But before we do that, let's do a quick knowledge check to make sure everyone's still following me. So let's say the tribally designated housing entity wants to build homes in a subdivision. Is this project a noise sensitive use? So you should see a poll question on the right-hand side of your screen. And let's see what people said. Okay, most people said that it is a noise sensitive use, and that is correct. And next poll question. Okay, next one. Let's say the tribe wants to build an outpatient clinic. Is this a noise sensitive use? Yes or no? And so you can type this in the chat box. Okay, we got about 2 yeses and everything else no. This one, by regulation or guidance, it would not necessarily be a noise sensitive use, but if you wanted to consider it a noise sensitive use because you don't want your patients and your doctors and providers to be exposed to constant loud noise while they're trying to run exams or do dialysis um, or otherwise treat patients, or you can still consider this a noise sensitive use, but by default you don't need to consider it. Okay, and then screening for noise generators. So if you are a noise sensitive use, then you screen for the noise generators. So then you want to ask yourself, is your project within 1,000 feet of a major road, 3,000 feet of a railroad, or 15 miles of an airport? If you aren't, then you want to document this with maps showing distances from your project to nearest airports, or showing that you don't have any railroads or major roads within 3,000 feet or 1,000 feet. So you just put those maps in your environmental review and you're in compliance. But if you have any combination of a road, major road, railroad, or airport, then you will have to do the next step, which is looking up the traffic and operations data. And then here's a peek at the HUD's day-night level calculator, day-night noise levels, shortening that to DNL. And there's a question, we have a Navy base here that flies jets, would that need to be included? That would probably be a loud, a different loud noise source. So on the DNL calculator, I mean, if you're able to find contour maps of the airport noise levels, then yes, you do consider it, and you consider it under the airport noise level if you're able to find that information. Otherwise, you can consider it in other noise source and put that under loud impulse sounds, which says yes, no on this chart or on this calculator. So we'll walk through the calculator later, but that's a great question, and I know that does affect a lot of rural and tribal communities. Okay, where do you find those calculator forms? I will have a link at the end of the presentation. And for those of you who want to follow along, I should have mentioned this in the beginning, the slides should have been shared with you through the email that you received today about joining the webinar. And if you didn't get that, then Carissa is going to paste the link into the chat box. Okay, and question on major road. We will talk about major roads in a couple of slides, so stay tuned. Okay, and then Carissa just pasted a link to the class page where you can download and print these slides. And I do have all the websites listed on the last page. We also have some other documents that are posted along with for the materials that I will go over later. So let's start with airports. I'll get to roads later, but let's start with airports. And so there are two types of airports we might be looking at for if we don't count the military bases. You have your small airports and your large airports. If you think you have an airport that's a small airport, then you confirm that by researching its annual flight operations. If those operations are less than a certain threshold, then it's a small airport and the noise is not going to extend beyond the airport boundaries. But if those operations if they do meet a threshold for noise extending beyond the airport boundary, then you need to look up its noise contour map. And for any larger airport where, it's a regional airport, international airport, or it's the main airport that people get to you through, then you just skip straight to finding your noise contour maps. That's something that you might find online through the city or airport's land use plan. You can also call the airport operator and ask for the noise contour map, and hopefully they can provide you with a copy. And then once you get that map, you look for the location of your project in relation to those noise contours. So is your project within a noise contour line? And if so, you put that level into the HUD's DNL calculator. So starting with the small airports, if you have a small airport, you confirm it by looking up the operations data. There is a website that I've pasted here, and through that search, which I'll show you how the web pages look at the end of the webinar, but on that page you can look up any airport that reports to the Federal Aviation Administration. In this example, I have Tahlequah Municipal Airport, and you want to look for the based aircraft and operations. And then under that section, it'll tell you the number of operations for a single year. And the data for this one is from 2021. Here we have, total operations, that's 15,000. Well, is that large or small? Is that a lot of planes or is that few planes? To do that, to analyze that, we look at the small airports worksheet, which should also be on the class page. And so we have the operations data, and then we compare it to the numbers in the small airports worksheet. On question 3, it says to determine if the annual number of operations for each of these types of flights exceeds thresholds. So the first one, air carrier operations, is this 9,000 or more? And we saw for Tahlequah it's 0, so it's not more than 9,000. Air taxi is 0, so again, no. Military operations, no military operations, so no. And then general aviation, 72,000 or more, we have 15,000 total, so that's going to be no. So if all of those are no, then this project, even though it is within 15 miles of Tahlequah Municipal Airport, because the airport has few flight operations, the noise generated by the airport is not expected to extend beyond the airport boundaries. See small airports worksheet and the operations data. So this is what you would put in your environmental review regarding small airports. Okay, another question that you guys can just type the answer to in the chat. Or I think a poll might have just popped up. What is the airport noise level here? The location is the purple dot to the right, I'm sorry, on the left-hand side. Just practice reading. Okay, we'll wait for maybe just a couple more people to answer. We see the red is the airport property line, and then under the legend, there's 65 decibels, 75 decibels, and 70 decibels. So where is the purple dot? Okay, the majority of you said B, 65, and that is correct. It is within the line that is 65 decibels. There was a request to go back to the previous slide, so I'm just going to honor that request real quickly. Again, the question 3 that's from the small airports worksheet, which I'll show you the full document later. The operations data is coming from that GCR website. Some people weren't able to vote on the poll. Sorry about that. And then the bottom is what you would put in your environmental review as your reasoning under compliance determination. Okay, and so for this airport, which is Lawton Municipal Airport in Oklahoma, you say your project location or site ID, the record date, your name and title, and then just under airport noise level, you would just say 65, and you pull that from that airport noise contour map. If you're able to get that information for your naval base or Army Air Force base or any other military operations, then you'd basically do the same thing. But if you're not able to find that information, then you can just say yes to loud impulse sounds. Okay, moving on to trains. If you have trains within 3,000 feet of your project, then you want to look up train operations data. So the train counts, you can find train counts for all railroad crossings in the US through the Federal Rail Administration website. At least one state, and that's Oklahoma, has their state Department of Transportation has train data, so you can use their website if you're in Oklahoma. If you don't have that information, if you want to get more up-to-date information, you can always call the railroad operator and ask how many trains run through that area. And you're looking for information including the number of day trains, night trains, and switching trains. Night trains are going to be weighted more heavily in HUD's calculator because noise at night is what's going to keep people awake and unable to sleep. So night is weighted more heavily. You'll want the average or maximum speed, whistles or horns. So any train crossing at grade is going to blow a whistle or horn. And so is your project within a quarter mile of a railroad crossing? If yes, then you're going to have horn or whistle being blown. Are there bolted or welded tracks? Okay, so here's an example where this is Pueblo in New Mexico. Let's say they want to do new construction where that pink cross is on the bottom of the screen. And that location is about 1,300 feet away from the BNSF railroad line. And so then we look up the data for that. And so we go to the Federal Rail Administration Crossing Inventory Lookup website and look up, I think this one I looked up the county, Cibola County, and I found that in Laguna. So I found the railroad crossing that was closest to the project, and I generated a report. All of these reports look the same. They're a US DOT crossing inventory form, and you want to look at part 2, which is going to be on the bottom of the first page. And so this is what that looks like. And under railroad information, you're going to look for the total day through trains, night through trains, switching trains, and typical speed range, and you want the maximum speed. And so here we have 34 night trains, 34 day trains, going 90 miles per hour, and no switching trains. You input all of that data into the HUD DNL calculator. First, you have to add a rail source, and then all of these fields will pop up. The track identifier, I usually put the railroad crossing number, and then diesel is going to be your freight trains. Effective distance, let's say it was 1300. Train speed, we said 90. If you don't know the engines per train or the railway cars per train, then the default is going to be 2 and 50. Average train operations, that was 34 plus 34, so that's 68. Night fraction, easier way would just be, well, 50, it was the same number of day and same number of night trains, so you could say that that's 50%. Here I say 38, and I'll explain that in the next slide. Railway whistles or horns or bolted tracks, I said yes. If you're not sure, you can always say yes, and that will give you the more conservative estimate. And then I have a photo of some bolted tracks on the right. Night percentage of trains. I mentioned before that night is weighted more heavily. And the reason why I didn't say 50% on the previous screen is because the Federal Rail Administration data shows night trains or defines them as 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., whereas HUD defines night hours as 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. Because people usually go to sleep between 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And so there is some unofficial HUD guidance for calculation for the night fraction. So simple formula, we multiply the night trains and the switching trains by a certain factor, and you divide it by the total number of trains. And so that's how I got the 38%. If this is confusing, don't worry, just say 50% day and night. Okay, so let's see. Rob, we had a couple of questions, I think.
Yeah, there was one about how would you count trains on tracks that merge?
Trains on tracks that merge. I would probably still go to the nearest railroad crossing and look for data on that crossing and just see how the FRA or Federal Rail Administration, I would see how they counted it. And so I wouldn't try to figure that out myself. I would just see what was reported. Okay, so next is road traffic data. So if you have a major road, which again, I will explain what a major road might be in a couple of slides, but the information you're looking for is the AADT, that's your annual average daily traffic. So that's basically your traffic volume. If you're able to, get information on the percentage of medium and large trucks. The road gradient, how much does the road slope? And stop signs along the road being analyzed within 600 feet of the project, and then the speed limit. In this example, I have it's really hard to see, but there's a house that's right on the corner of Main Street and a side street. And going east and west, the daily traffic, average daily traffic is about 8,600. And then among that, the daily truck traffic is going to be 16 or 1,700. And that was for 2013, so maybe they don't have more recent data. And just a note on measuring distances, you want to measure from 6 feet out of the house or 6.5 feet from the house or whatever building to the center of all lanes, so the average of the nearest and furthest lanes. Okay, so if I put that information into the DNL calculator after I add a road source, so I have Main Street, let's say the effective distance was 84 feet. There's no stop sign here. We can see through Google Earth that they have red lights or traffic lights, so no stop signs. Average speed I found through Google Earth was 25 miles per hour. Average daily trips, I'm just going to round up because they want a 10-year projection. So let's say 7,000 cars. Actually, I didn't really round up here, but 7,000 cars. I didn't really know the breakdown between medium trucks and heavy trucks. So here I'm just going to estimate, or I'd have to call the traffic engineer at the State Department of Transportation. Let's say it was 1,000 medium trucks and 700 heavy trucks. How much of that traffic occurs at night? If I don't know, or if I can't find that information, then I can just assume 15%. Road gradient, that's going to be your slope or your rise over run. If I don't have that information, I can assume 2%. And then I calculate the road DNL, and it gives me three numbers, so one for each of the types of vehicles, and then combined together, they actually make a louder combined noise. So the total vehicle noise is going to be 70 decibels in this case. Okay, so major roads. What is considered a major road? I don't think this is in the HUD regulations or even the HUD guidance, but just from experience and talking to different HUD staff, generally you can say several things. A major road can be a highway, state route, major arterial road, a road with 4+ lanes, a road with 10,000 vehicles per day. All of those would potentially be major roads. That does not mean that a road with fewer than 4 lanes or fewer than 10,000 vehicles per day doesn't mean that that can't be a major road. Like we saw in the previous example, that only had less than 8,000 vehicles per day, and we still got a 70 decibels for the noise calculation, because it depends on the distance you are from the project and the amount of truck traffic. And the example we saw earlier was in an area of North Dakota that has a lot of mining operations, natural gas and oil mining, so there's a ton of truck traffic going through there. So if you're a house that's right on the road, then even if it only has 4,000 or 7,000 vehicles going by per day, it can still have large noise. And then there's a photo on the bottom where you can see a 4-lane road separated by a terrace. And then there's a house on the right that's, about 20, 25 feet from the road. So um, this has the potential to be a noise concern. So I would consider this one a major road and just do the research on the data. A question came in on if if the data was from 2013, can we use it, or do we need to get a traffic study? Do we need to get a traffic consultant? How old can the data be and still be used? I would say don't necessarily get a traffic consultant, but definitely contact your State Department of Transportation and ask them about, do you have updated data? And if you don't, then can you tell us what you think the projected changes are? And again, you want to project the data out 10 years. If there's a lot of planned development in the area, more commercial, more mining, or other types of development, then maybe you do expect there will be more truck and car traffic in the future. So that number might grow from what the current number is even. So it's always good to talk to a traffic engineer, and then they can tell you, well, this is the data we have, but just based off of old trends, we can say you can multiply these numbers by 1.3 or 1.4 or some factor, and then they can tell you that that can give you an estimate of the projected traffic today and in 10 years. So I would not recommend getting a traffic consultant to do an updated traffic count. And I'll let HUD jump in if they have any comments on that. Otherwise, I will continue on major roads. Um, so another thing to think about on whether you need to consider the noise level of a road in your calculation is it close to other noise sources? Volume of truck traffic, as I said before, level of nearby development, and availability of data. The bottom left-hand side, you see Highway 66 is parallel to a railroad and is parallel to a housing development. This housing development is very close to the railroad and to the highway, and so automatically I'd say, okay, that even if you're in a highly rural area, I would still consider I would still do a full noise analysis on this because the houses are so close to both the railroad and the highway. And in this case, the highway data came out to, I think, 15 or 25,000 cars. So there is a real noise concern for these housing units. And then on the center right hand, that map, this comes from Louisiana State Department of Transportation, their traffic website. And on this website, you can see wherever the blue boxes are, that's where the traffic counters give you the annual average daily traffic. And so Tunica Drive is going to be, that's 10,000 vehicles. Okay, that's definitely a major road. But then everything else, okay, well, the Route 115 that's perpendicular to it, parts of it have 4,000 vehicles. And okay, if your home is right on that road, I would consider it a major road. Otherwise, if you're a couple hundred feet away, I don't think I would really count Route 115. And then you have these side streets that only have, 300, 400, 100 cars. Those are absolutely not major roads. I would not worry about counting them. And here's another example in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, where on the left-hand side you see Interstate 75, which actually has pretty low traffic counts. It's about 2,000 it's about 2,000 as you go further north. Um, I would only really count this if you were close to both the road and the railroad. So it's like, well, if I'm already counting the railroad, then I can, and if you're super close to the road, then I might count this one. And then Ashman Street on the right, that is definitely a major road. It's got 15,000 cars to the south and 1,000 vehicles to the north. And then it gets to the very north, it gets smaller, so I wouldn't worry about it up there. And then all those side streets like Easterday Ave or Minneapolis Ave, the state isn't even keeping data on it, so those those streets would not be considered major roads because even the state isn't collecting data. So just keep it simple. Let's see, there was a question. What would be an expectable date year to use without having to go through that process? Most states will have data from the last 2, 3 years, and I always just round up. Sometimes I've given some states a call, and the traffic engineer will tell me to just multiply that number by the traffic count by a certain number to project out for 10 years. I don't think there's really a rule of thumb about uh, what is acceptable for the traffic data. Yeah, if you're in doubt, you can always just contact the traffic engineer at the State Department of Transportation for your state. And then here's a third example, and I'm showing you all these examples because I want you to see how these maps look. A couple of states don't have interactive maps. They just have PDF files that you have to download and figure out where your road is. But probably about like 40 or so states do have interactive websites where you can zoom in on a map and find the traffic counts for your project area. This example, Passamaquoddy Reservation at Pleasant Point in Maine, just by looking at the shape of it, it's coastal, it's a very small community. I doubt there are any major roads there. You can see a yellow line on the top left, and where it's like the black dot and the green marker, When I click that and it tells me that the factored, and I don't know what they mean by factored, but the factored annual average daily traffic count is 1,200. It's very small. I wouldn't call that a major road. It tells me the number of lanes and it tells me the speed limit. So, oh, okay, if I ever do a project in Maine, then I know that I can get all this information from them. But in this case, no major roads in this community at all. And then just to illustrate the importance of distance on your calculations, let's say you have a hypothetical road 500 feet from your project, 45 miles per hour, about 11,000 vehicles, 8% medium trucks and 5% combination or large trucks, 15% night fraction and 2% road gradient. Okay, comes out to 58. That's acceptable, not a big deal. Now, if we decrease that distance of 500 feet to 50 feet, where your housing development is now going to be on that road, that number increases to 73. So that's a pretty big difference, 15 points, 15 decibels. And to really bring home this point, noise levels add up. So even if separately your noise levels from the roads and from the train, they're all acceptable. But when you add them up, they actually make the project louder. So in this example, you have South Highway 88, let's say you're about 150 feet from it, and the DNL for the road came out to 59. But there's also a Union Pacific line on the southwest side, to the southwest of the project. And so we also want to do that calculation. So let's say that's 900 feet from our project. And so then we fill it out. We found out the average train speeds, 35, railway cars, train operations, whistles and horns, that came out to 64. That is also acceptable. But then when you calculate the combined noise from both the rail and the roads, now you get 66 and you're in a normally unacceptable noise zone. So that's something where you always have to go to the bottom of the calculator and make sure you calculate the combined road and rail. And if you have an airport, also adding in the airport noise. Okay, so knowledge check. In this example, we have a home that's 400 feet. Let's say they want to build another home next door to that one. That's basically the same orientation, 400 feet away. And we have the traffic data. From the database, we can see last year there were 6,000 vehicles, and then of that 6,000, 10% were trucks. And of those trucks, 450 of them were large trucks. And so here they tell you the Federal Highway Administration class 5 to 13 or class 8 to 13. So just looking at this, and it's like this one's totally guessing. I don't expect you to know the answer, but would you think this is a major road? Yes or no, or only if there are other noise sources nearby? 6,000 vehicles. It is right on the road, but it's actually quite far away from the road. It's actually 400 feet and not. So it looks like there's a really large setback or maybe even a right of way that separates the home from the road. And then, 10% of the vehicles are trucks. So that is a pretty large proportion of trucks. So, okay, looks like people so far are tied on yes or no. And a couple of you said only if there are other noise sources nearby. Okay, so question is, most data I've come across usually shows the AADT, but in the DNL calculator asks for ADT. Do we divide the AADT by days in a year? Here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Danielle, the ADT here is the same as the AADT, so don't divide, just use the number that you see. Yeah, I would just say AADT and ADT for the noise calculator are going to be the same. But yeah, that is confusing. So then here, when to show you the answer to this, so about 400 feet away, 35 miles per hour, 6,000 daily trips, 10% truck traffic, and it came out to 59, which is acceptable. So in this case, by itself, and let me just show you again, by itself, this Route 3 is not a major road. I would only consider it if there were also, another major road or or train tracks or a rail or a airport nearby. And this is something that, takes some practice to really get a handle on. For me, I usually just do a noise analysis on everything until I have more experience on, oh, okay, like in this case, I've done this enough that, okay, with these numbers, this is not a major road. So not really any right or wrong answer, but in this case, it didn't really change the noise, or the noise is very acceptable, like way below 65 decibels. So only if you also had a train would I really care about this one. Okay, and then miscellaneous noise sources. So if you have military operations where you can't find a noise contour map, quarries, or even grain elevators, I've heard can be very loud. Then in the noise calculator for impulse sounds, you would say yes instead of no. And then the calculator will automatically add 8 decibels to the calculation. And this is where if you want to say, well, it's not really 8 decibels, it is loud, but it's not 8 decibels, then this is where you would work with your HUD environmental officer and figure out, okay, do we need to get a traffic engineer or do a traffic study, or not even a traffic study, but like a noise study to get that number lower. So that's something where if you're in that situation and you want to demonstrate that you shouldn't add 8 to your noise level, then you would have to find alternative studies to justify that. Okay, so again, on 65 and under is acceptable. 66 to 75 is normally unacceptable, and above 75 is, so 76 and above is going to be unacceptable. Okay, question. In the instance with the railroad noise, how do you consider the noise generated at a switching yard where the trains and cars are coupling and uncoupling? Here you would include the number of switching trains um, in the calculation. And I don't have a good example of that at the moment. That's a great question. Okay, so what do the results mean if you're acceptable, normally unacceptable, or the acceptable, normally unacceptable, or unacceptable? So if your project is only modernization or minor rehab, that's above 65 decibels. And again, minor rehab is rehab that qualifies for CEST environmental review. Then HUD encourages noise attenuation measures, whether that's extra insulation, more energy efficient windows, more energy efficient doors, staggered studs, sealed gaps, things like that. For major or substantial rehab, which is defined as rehab that requires an environmental assessment, HUD shall actively seek incorporation of noise attenuation measures. If you're putting in so much money and resources into a rehab project, then it's only fair that you invest some of that spending into more noise insulation to make the project better. Otherwise, it's not really a good project. And then for new construction, if you're doing a CEST level new construction, such as building 2 new homes on 2 lots. If you're in the normally unacceptable noise zone, then you have to change your CEST to an environmental assessment. And then regardless, your interior noise levels should be reduced by at least 5 decibels if you're between 66 and 70, or 10 decibels if you're between 71 and 75 decibels. And that comes straight from the regulations. If you're in an area that's more than 75 decibels, then new construction of a noise sensitive use is generally not allowed without a lot of approvals. Just to summarize all of those slides that I just went through, if you're 65 and under, you're acceptable. If you're 66 to 75, depends on, for the other two categories, depends on what type of activity you're doing. Modernization or minor rehab, if you're above the 65, then HUD encourages noise attenuation. If you're doing substantial rehab or EA level rehab, then HUD actively seeks incorporation of noise attenuation measures in your project if it's between 66 and 75 decibels. Otherwise, HUD strongly encourages that you convert the project to a compatible land use because it's pretty loud noise, and that's not really a good idea to have to invest so much money into a project with high noise levels. If you're doing new construction, at 66 to 75, you have to reduce the interior noise levels. If it's more than 75 decibels, then it's not really permitted without a lot of approvals from different folks, and you would definitely need to mitigate. Okay, going back to the previous question, switching yards, would you mark that as a loud impulse sound? I think I would count that under trains. Yeah, I'd probably count that under train operations, instead of a separate one. Okay, strategies for mitigation. Okay, let's see, we have another question. Does noise need to be evaluated at all if the funding is only being used to purchase property with an existing residential building on site? I will go back, see, I'm on slide 50 now, and we go back to the regulations and show you HUD support for existing construction. Noise exposure by itself will not result in denial for purchase and resale or resale and purchase, but is a marketability factor. So if you're only using to purchase property according to HUD regulations, under this bullet point number 4, it should be okay to purchase an existing building. If you're going to rehab it, that's when you have to, go through the rest of the analysis that we talked about. Okay, but a great question. Okay, if your project does need mitigation measures, there are 3 ways you can really think about 3 strategies to mitigate. The first one we mentioned already is making structural changes to the building, increasing the insulation of the building envelope. You could also build a noise barrier, build a noise wall to shield your noise sensitive use from that noise source. And then third one that folks don't always consider, and it really only makes sense if you're doing new construction, is moving the project further away from the noise source. So instead of having it very close to the train tracks, you could move it, 100 feet or 50 feet away to lessen that noise. Just more examples of structural changes. Again, you're typically going to be your windows, doors, walls, and insulation. And then real briefly, want to mention StrayCat. This is a HUD tool, the sound transmission classifications and assessment tool, where in part 1 you write the address of the property and of your project and the noise level that you calculated. And then part two, you get to design a wall. And this is where you really need to consult a construction manager, engineer, or architect. And so you put in the wall dimensions and the type of wall that is closest to the noise source. And then you add the windows, how many windows and what type, and how many doors and what type. And then automatically on the bottom right-hand side of the screen under evaluation criteria, it'll tell you, okay, you said you had 75 decibels, and then the combined STC rating, that's sound transmission classification, for the wall assembly was 30, and then the required one was 33. Does the wall assembly meet requirements? No. So here, given these calculations, I would go back to my architect, engineer, or construction manager and have them change out the material. Maybe start with the windows and the doors, and if not, well, if we're building something new, then we can change the wall material and just make that wall more insulating until we get a yes on the bottom of that screen. Okay. Question, assuming the preliminary screening finds a noise source within the radii, do you have to have a minimum of 2 NALs? And can you remind me, NALs, is that about lanes or noise affected lanes? Sorry, I'm not up to speed with my acronyms there, so if you could just clarify what you mean by NALs, I can try to answer that question. But in the meantime, let's continue. Oh yeah, okay, minimum of 2 NALs. NALs are locations you calculate the noise levels at. I have not heard of having a minimum of 2. Yeah, I would just say the closest part of the house to the noise source. Yeah, I think 1 is fine, and you're gonna want to have a 6.5-foot setback from there. And especially, your tribal projects, very rural, it doesn't make sense to, like, don't try to do more work than is necessary. Okay, for noise barriers, you can do noise walls, earthen berms. Don't use trees. Trees are, I get that question a lot, and they might give you more privacy, but they can fall over, they can have gaps, they can lose their leaves. They are not effective in reducing noise to any extent that HUD will allow. And then for noise walls, if you are going to build a noise wall, there is a barrier performance module on the HUD Exchange website. Again, you want to consult your architect or engineer to design this, and then they can input different data on the height, distance, things like that, distance from the wall to the building, distance from the wall to the noise source, and things like that. And then it will tell you if your noise wall is effective at mitigating the noise level to under whatever the requirement is in your situation. If you're going to change the site configuration, especially if you're doing new construction, you can always move the noise sensitive use further from the noise source. So, if you're on a highway or on a major road, you can try to increase the setback so that the folks don't hear the road noise as much. Yeah, set it farther away from the trains. Okay. And then I think the last knowledge check, just to make sure you're following me. If you're building new housing in an area with normally unacceptable noise exposure, which of the following is not a valid attenuation measure? Moving the house away, planting a row of trees, using triple paned windows, or building a noise barrier. Okay, so this one's pretty easy if you guys were paying attention in the last minute. Uh, just about everyone got this one right. Thinking someone might have clicked the wrong button. But yeah, Planting a row of trees is not valid. Everything else is good. Okay, so that one was easy. So do not plant trees. You can plant trees, but don't count that as mitigation. All right, so I want to spend the rest of the time today just kind of going over sample noise assessments that you might see for an environmental review in a tribal community. These aren't actual examples. I'm just showing you, if folks were to do housing projects in these areas, this is what the data would look like, and this is what you would put in your environmental review. Let's say you're super rural, you have no noise generators nearby. So this would be the Colville Reservation. So if you're in Nispelum, you're over 25 miles from the nearest airport. In a 3,000 feet radius, there are no train tracks, and um, Highway 155 is more than 1,000 feet away. And honestly, Highway 155 probably isn't a major road. It's just the largest road in that area, but it probably doesn't even get that much traffic. So Nispelum, no noise issues as far as transportation goes. So then in your review, you would just say the project is not within 15 miles of an airport, 3,000 feet of a railroad, or 1,000 feet of a major road. Let's say you only had a small airport nearby. If you're on the Pine Ridge Reservation, you're within 3 miles of Pine Ridge Airport, no major roads and no railroads, as you see in the bottom map. So then I look up the airport operations. It's 2,400 operations a year, and that's from this year. So there's an airport, but it's really not going to generate much noise. So what you'd say is, the project is not within 3,000 feet of a railroad or 1,000 feet of a major road, but within 15 miles of a railroad. As the airport operations are low, the noise is unlikely to extend beyond the airport boundaries. See airport operations data and small airport worksheet. Okay, if you had a train nearby, then you look up the train data. In this case, through trains, night and day, maximum speed, do the calculation, and that came out to 62 decibels. And so I would say the project is not within 15 miles of an airport or 1,000 feet of a major road, but within 3,000 feet of a railroad. A noise assessment was performed, and the DNL was 62 decibels, which is acceptable. Okay, and if you have a major road, I think this is Richfield, Utah. And Utah actually has their information in a Google Earth layer that you download and open up in Google Earth. And so here we see North Main Street has over 10,000 vehicles a day. And of those 10,000 vehicles, 10% are large trucks. So combination unit trucks are going to be your large trucks. And then single unit trucks, that's almost 13%. So yeah, quite a bit of truck traffic there. And so then I do the calculation, and this came out to 58. So I'd say project is not within distance of an airport or railroad, but within distance of a road. A noise assessment was performed and came out to 58, which is acceptable. So this is really all that you would put in your environmental review for that. If you had a major road and a railroad, and you were doing new construction, so then I find the road data, and then the railroad distance and data. I think this is Oklahoma. And so Oklahoma has its own website that will tell you the train traffic and train counts. And so I calculate the road noise, came out to 54. And again, the average daily trips or annual average daily trips will be for a 10-year projection. And here I just assumed 5% single unit trucks and 3% combination trucks because I couldn't find more information. And then putting in the train maximum speed was 25. Uh, that came out to 54. So combined it was 57. So this one had two noise sources, but it was fine. Okay, and then the very end, before we open the floor to questions, I want to show you the research as you would do this in person, or do this in real time. Let's say I'm on the Yankton Sioux Reservation and working the town of Wagner and wanted to do a new construction project here. You see there is an airport nearby, Wagner Municipal Airport, a train track, and a highway that may or may not be a major road. So I would find the measurement, the distance to the train line, the railroad. It's about 600 or 700 feet, could probably round down, and then to the road is about 200 feet. So then my next order of business is to do the research on the operations. So I'll show you how this website works. GC. Okay, there we go. So let's say Wagner, submit, and I get a couple of airports called Wagner, but I want Wagner Municipal in South Dakota. I can click on it and it'll give me everything on the screen, or I can click on a PDF. So here I'll show you what the PDF looks like. And so I want the operations data here. And so you see it's operations is 3,000 for last year. So automatically small airport, I'm not going to worry about it. Then South Dakota, so this now I'm on the Federal Railroad Administration, railroad crossing inventory. And so I look up the state, South Dakota. I can do it by county or city. County is sometimes easier because I don't have to scroll through so many cities. And I'm in Charles Mix County, and I run the query. And then it gives me all of the railroad crossings in Charles Mix County. I want the one in Wagner, and then when I looked up the closest one, that's going to be High Avenue. So I select just one crossing, and I generate a report. And it gives it to me in a PDF. And I want to scroll down to railroad information 00025. Okay, this one actually doesn't even have any trains. And then finally, traffic data. I'm going to click on the segment and Highway 46. And from 2 years ago, 4,500 cars. We're about 200 feet away, so it's probably not a big deal. Here it gives me the truck percent. It doesn't tell me the breakdown between combo and single, so it's something where I can probably just round up. Here it does give me a projected 35-year, 25-year ADT, so that's pretty cool. So I would probably just use a 6,000 and just add in, do 7% of that as trucks. Okay, so this example actually didn't have trains, but we'll just pretend that it did. So Wagner sample road name, Highway 46. Okay, let's say it turned out to be about 180 feet, no stop sign. Let's say it's 35 miles per hour, average daily trips. In 20 years, it's going to be about 6,000, but then maybe some percentage of that is going to be trucks and 7%. Okay, doesn't have to be that exact, but at least that 7% that we saw earlier. This is more than 7, this is more than 10%. Night fraction, and South Dakota is pretty flat, but we'll just say 2%. This came out pretty high, 63. So in this case, we didn't have any railroad cars, but let's pretend that, or sorry, no trains. Let's say that there were trains here, just for the example, so that we can see the calculation. Trying to find the crossing number here, and it's going to be up here. Diesel effective distance, let's say it came out to 650. Train speed, we saw it was 25. Now, if we don't know, when I hover my mouse over here, it gives me different text tips on what to put here. So default is 2, default is 50. And here it was 0, but let's say it actually was 5. And the night fraction, let's say 50%. And that came out to 63. No airport and no loud impulse sounds, and you calculate. And now with those 5 imaginary trains, we got to a normally unacceptable noise source. And that's when you would move on to thinking about ways to mitigate. Okay, so that's that. Let me go back to the presentation. In summary, you're only applying this to noise-sensitive projects. Noise attenuation measures are encouraged for minor rehab projects. An EA and noise attenuation are required for new construction in normally unacceptable noise zone. New construction generally not allowed when you're in an unacceptable noise zone. And then noise attenuation measures include reconfiguring the site, changing the building envelope, and building a barrier. Resources, so all of the websites that I mentioned today are included here. Also on the class page, with the materials, I have a resource with the Department of Transportation information, traffic information for all of the states. So each state from, Alabama to Wyoming, their websites on where to get that traffic count data. And that is current up through last week. So you can take a look at your own state data through that website, or sorry, that resource with the websites. Okay, any questions? Let's see. Okay, did I lose people there? Okay, let's see. Example plus part of the house. Okay. Between 66 and 75 decibels, EA is required for a new single-family dwelling. According to one reading of the regulations, yes. I will warn you guys that the noise regulations are not the easiest to understand, and they do have different parts that are almost contradictory, but um, the way I read them, it does require an E8 if you are between 65 and 75 if you're building a new home. How do you determine which stop sign to use if there are several? I would use the stop sign that is closest to your project. So the nearest stop sign that's on the road. It has to be on the major road. We're not talking about the stop sign that's on your road where your home is. We're talking about the stop sign that's um, on the road where you have all that car and truck traffic. Because as if you have a stop sign, then every single car and truck is going to stop, and the braking and the gas pedaling, that's going to have a lot more noise than when you have traffic lights that have, you stop, then you start, but then you have, 30 seconds of continuous traffic. Okay, any other questions I didn't get to, or if anyone at HUD would like to jump in and clarify anything, if I've said anything confusing? Okay, great. You can always contact your HUD field environmental officers and your HUD folks in ONAP, your ONAP representatives. You can always find more information on the Code Talk website and the HUD Exchange website. Pleasure giving this webinar, and anyone in Alaska will be here again in 3 weeks to talk about endangered species. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.